Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Free Agent Podcast. Super pumped. I've got Angela Alberty here. Angela, thanks so much for joining.
Well, thank you for having me, Beau. I'm excited to be here. Absolutely looking forward to digging into our podcast today.
Same. Thanks so much for joining. And I'm super pumped because, recently MyBasePay became a strategic partner of ours. You're co-founder, and MyBasePay is essentially an employer of record. You guys provide support to like staffing companies, helping them with compliance, onboarding, benefits, payroll, funding, and again, with kind of like the excitement surrounding the contract space and the fractional space in particular. I'm really happy to have you on.
Well, thank you for that. And man, what did you give a great overview of what we have to offer or what? We've had the opportunity to get our start a couple of years ago. We specialize in servicing a multitude of different audiences, from the independent consultant to the intermediary that's placing some of these consultants to the end client. So we really focus on servicing the ecosystem that's relative to contract labor, which is vast and large. But considering where the market is going, how work is being procured, how agile we need to respond from various layers within this marketplace, we're excited to be a part of it. And really the essence of what we do is managing that life cycle compliantly and productively, really, because, there's a lot of work that keeps, the lights on, I guess you could say, when it comes to the management of the day in, the day out, the weekly flow of contract labor. And that's what we'd like to specialize in.
And it terrifies the hell out of a lot of folks.
Yes.
It's so nuanced. And
well said.
yeah, prior to jumping in, what is an employer of record? That term's been around forever, and generally like international companies, park their license with an employer of record and they help them with back office and payroll. But in layman's, what is an employer of record as it pertains to like contractor, maybe like a staffing company and just abroad?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get into the fun game of acronym land here because there's a lot of different acronyms here that we cover, and the industry, for whatever reason, loves to spit these out. We like to consider ourselves an employer of record, EOR, an agent of record, AOR, and a vendor of record, VOR. And what that really means is that we are the responsible and liable party when it comes to the workforce deployment of various different kinds of workers. An employer of record is more suitable for an employee, a W-2 equivalent, if you think about it, somebody that is getting benefits, somebody that has either a full-time or part-time status, and somebody that you are paying employer taxes for, really is the employer of record segment that we handle. An agent of record is for that independent contractor, that fractional, that freelancer, the one that's acting as their own business entity, but needs to properly be classified as such, and really handled properly when it comes to direction and control, classification, and ongoing business relationship. And then we're a vendor of record. And the vendor of record really means that we are contractually engaged with the enterprise organizations that are tapping into these talent pool types. And that in and of itself, Beau, is the acronym soup that we like to make up the essence of what is MyBasePay.
And already my mind's blown, but I feel like that's a good segue into kind of the topic here. And again, so my firm, The Free Agent, as you're well aware, we do fractional executive level engagements. Some call consulting. Others may have an issue with me using that term. Regardless, it's generally a fraction of a work week. Sometimes it could be a full work week, but it's contract labor at its finest. And so, when I talk to a lot of folks that are considering that, some of the biggest blockers is like, what do I do first? Do I need an LLC? Do I not need an LLC? Should I go set up payroll at Gusto or MyBasePay as an example? Like, what's the basic blocking and tackling that somebody should consider if they're looking to hang out a shingle?
Well, I love this question, and I really think that it's symbolic. It's a sign of the times, right? I think Forbes, maybe it was Forbes that originally coined this term as the indepreneur, right? That independent entrepreneur that's going to make the leap. And obviously, as with anything, as big as a decision like this, step number one is really taking the commitment to say, I'm going to go down this route. And we firmly feel that that initial step is the biggest leap of faith, but getting things set up structurally from an infrastructure standpoint is critically important, but also from the front side of things. Who are going to be your clients? What is going to be your book of business? What is going to be the strategy that sets you apart in whatever particular purview it is? And really lining out what the business plan is and what that go-to-market strategy is going to be, so that you can hit the ground running once you have all of your housekeeping items in order, which quite frankly, this day and age is very, very easy to do, very convenient. It takes about a good amount of maybe 4 to 6 man hours to get the ball going in terms of getting your EIN set up, getting your LLC set up, understanding how you're going to bill, how you're going to pay. Those are all critical components, but I would really say spend a good amount of time in understanding what is your differentiator, what is your go-to-market strategy, who are going to be the targets for the book of business that you want to establish, and what are going to be those revenue markers that you want to hit every single quarter on a 5-year outlook, maybe, right? Maybe that's very intense, but looking at it from that broad stroke is super important in making this decision, so that you can really have a good amount of time focusing on how you build that continual book of business and how you keep that revenue stream coming in and out of the door. The other areas, I really call them like housekeeping items, right? Do you want to be an LLC? Do you want to be a sole proprietor? Do you want to be an S Corp, a C Corp? They all have their own different advantages, and it's uniquely positioned to what is going to be best for you. Most of the time, we suggest, an LLC of sorts, right? We want to limit the liability that you have. You want to insulate your organization versus any type of personal liability. And usually there's so many different websites that you can go to that allow you to do this in a matter of hours, right? So I think that that's step number one. And a lot of the benefits of utilizing a website like a LegalZoom or something like that is that they'll give you an operating agreement. They'll go ahead and go through the state requirements and the federal requirements so that you can do this. You can have software platforms like QuickBooks that let you do it very, very succinctly and quickly. So those housekeeping items are important, but I would really focus on the strategy and how you're going to differentiate yourself once this thing launches.
I think that's a robust response, and I totally agree. And it's funny, I wrote down a couple of different things: commitment, 4.5 hours, or 4 to 5 hours, and then LLC. And I tend to have that same conversation with folks about the commitment component. I'm like, if you're going to do this fractional type of business, or maybe you're open to full-time and fractional, and you're spending 50% of your time on one or the other, it's going to be hard to be effective at either one camp. So having a commitment to kind of go in and all in on the fractional side of the house, I feel is part of the cornerstone of building a successful practice. Additionally, too,
certainly, like, you're not alone in this, right? Oh, we mentioned this earlier, but 37% of the US workforce is working on some form of a contingent basis. There's so many different resources. You can open up TikTok, Instagram. There's going to be a lot of different resources out there that just give you guiding points on what makes sense to you. But what's even more fascinating about this is that this projected area of fractional contingent support is only going to grow. So we're really at the hindsight of what I think, and this is where I geek out a little bit, of how work is going to be procured, right? I think we've built, even statutorily speaking, like the last 40 years, we have built our traditional working model where you clock in, you spend, your 401k, you get the gold watch at the end of your 40-year run.
You're lucky. Usually you just get a pin.
Or you could get a pen. Yeah, you could get a fancy pen too. But you cash in that 401k and you have spent your career at said company. And really the day of that, I think is completely at the end, right? Of what we believe traditional working models are going to look like. So you're not alone in this. And there's so many different resources that are out there. And really this is catching wind to what we know. And you speak to this all the time, Beau, of what's changing. 1 out of every 2 workers will be working in this type of fashion within the next 5 years. So it's completely going to transform the way that we think about work.
No, 100%. And 70% of executives would leave their job tomorrow for fractional executive work or just to be independent. So definitely is the way it's headed. But to your point, though, there's a lot of tools out there. I started my company 8 years ago, and I did everything manually, and it took definitely more than 4 to 5 hours. But at the time, there were no tools, and at that time as well, that's typically when you would hire an attorney. And now, I mean, honestly, it's pretty easy to figure out. LLC, simple thing to do. Bank accounts, simple. EIN, et cetera. So definitely a sign of the times. It's becoming easier and easier to crank out your own independent consultancy. In that vein, I feel like a big deal with independence, like the contractor status. Like, how can they ensure that they're like, identified properly within an organization? Because there's things you can do, things you can't do. Like I know as an example, you can't go to happy hour if you're an independent consultant. But talk to us a little bit like what determines independent contractor status and maybe some rough guidelines as to making sure that somebody stays within that.
Yeah, well, I think a good way for us to look forward on this is to take a step back and look at the historical context of what's led organizations to have these sorts of parameters in place to protect each party, their own party included, along with the independent contractor. There have been large organizations, and we're going back to like, we're throwing a lot of different stats at you guys out in this episode. 1 out of every 3 workers. But if you look at the makeup of large organizations, let's take a look at Microsoft, Apple, even down here where I'm at in Houston, some oil and gas companies, the lion's share of their worker model is external workers. It's not the full-time workers. So they have certainly put some parameters in place to follow if you want to contract with them. And some of those parameters are going to start with the type of engagement that you are providing in terms of the services. Is this type of engagement going to be routed through procurement? Is it going to be routed through some form of HR or talent acquisition? However it is that it's actually departmentalized is going to impact the way that you actually need to fulfill the requirements to service this company. The bigger the company, you can expect the longer the laundry list of requirements it is to be able to tap into that book of business. And it's really going back to what is going to be the strategy for you to go to market and what are going to be those steps that you need to build into your company to be able to successfully go to market. Many different companies, unless you are working with a very niche group that's small, that maybe doesn't have a robust procurement team, but many different size companies are going to say you're going to have some kind of contractual engagement in place. You're going to have some form of insurances. You may need to be okay with not getting paid until 30, 45, 60 days later. You also need to be able to follow X, Y, and Z compliance parameters within this contract to do business with us, submit hours this way, invoice that other way. So there's all of these different areas that are built into, can I tap into this company, and are these requirements actually fulfillable for me as an independent contractor? Did I just make up a word? Fulfillable, maybe. But yeah, those are all considerations for an independent contractor to make. And there's plenty of different intermediaries that come in and support independent contractors when it comes to providing these services while still, being convenient in terms of the requirements and ease of use and how you submit those hours, how you get paid for those hours, etc.
Yeah, so pretty interesting. The insurance requirement is a tough one. I've actually had business, I've been in business for 8 years. I've had some businesses or opportunities that I've had to walk away because the requirements that they had for insurance were literally were more expensive than the actual contractual per people we would put to work, which is insane. And they just had basically this boilerplate, very, very large business that some other Fortune 50 company would sign. But I'm a small organization, and for me it was cost prohibitive. It did not make business sense. I had to walk away, which is crazy. And then the payment terms is also a bit of a gotcha, where a lot of these big businesses are like, hey, we promote small business, but at the very least you're going to be on a net 30, maybe net 45, and that can be a bit daunting to the independent consultant, where they do their work, then they invoice, and they're still waiting another 30 days before they even receive payment. Now, of course, there's ways to negotiate upfront payment, and there's ways around it. But a lot of times with the big companies, they're not going to budge. Shameless plug for MyBasePay. Do you guys help the individual like consultants kind of mitigate payment with any services that you offer?
Absolutely, 100%. And so that's essentially part of what we're offering on the vendor of record side. So just as much as we are an agent of record and making sure that the worker is properly classified, that we're running through a compliant process, we're also acting as a vendor of record for many of these large enterprises. And if you really take a look at some of these programs, there are, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of inhibitors for them to actually be able to attract independent contractors and freelancers. And many of those are areas that we've touched on. But what we do with these enterprise organizations is we actually have the contractual engagement. We may have a subcontractor agreement that would line up through an independent contractor to say that they can service this account, but we're also fulfilling the requirements. We're providing our insurance policies as part of this package. We are the contractually engaged party. We are also funding on payroll and payment terms to the independent contractors. So really, they're looking at a week cycle of work, meaning they did work last week, they get paid for it this week in our model. And it's a very win-win situation for the end organization themselves, because they're running through the process with a compliant party, but also, of course, for the independent contractor, because it's not necessarily sustainable for them to be able to go on 60-day payment terms with monthly billing and an errors and omissions tech liability policy at $10 million. Most of the time, they won't even qualify if they go to market to be able to service that kind of policy limit. So we really come in and help support the infrastructure and make this a symbiotic relationship across all fronts.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a win-win with you guys where you can help, the individual contractor float payroll. I'm glad we met. I mean, obviously we leverage your service with some deployments, and it's been a godsend because both the contractor and the company are happy. The company can have their net 30, net 45, but then the contractor actually gets paid for the work they've done very, very quickly. I think that's a good, turn into the next question in regards to like W-2 versus 1099. I feel like a lot of people may put the W-2 designation on a pedestal, but I'd love for you to kind of quickly walk through maybe the differences, and if a company gave a contractor the option for W-2, if they should take it, or maybe what some considerations are.
Yeah, the W-2 or 1099, if we can be so Shakespearean when we say that. Well, I think it's really good to start off with saying like, hey, these opinions are of my own. And it's all shifting. It's shifting because it's when you look at W-2 and or 1099 classification, especially on the 1099 front, it hasn't necessarily been this black and white process. We live in a world of gray that, at least in the United States, is guided by three major forces: the state and what they regulate when it comes to tapping into 1099s, the IRS, and when it comes time to pay those taxes when this work is procured, and then the Department of Labor. And they've all kind of set up their own processes and areas to consider when it comes to classifying workers. What we do know that's for certain is a couple of different things. Because there is a large growing segment of independent contractor labor, there also is going to be an even larger segment of the regulatory bodies that oversee this type of working class. So you can bet your bottom dollar, as the saying goes, that there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on organizations that tap into independent contractors to ensure that they have processes in place that are properly classifying these workers. And when it comes to the difference between a W-2 and a 1099, they vary. There's a whole bunch of different elements. Is this worker standing alongside people that are employees and full-time? Are they doing work that is finite, meaning, in the same way that I would get a painter to come into my house to paint a wall? They're going to do a job and they're going to be done with that job, and then the relationship is done. Or is this ongoing and continual? Am I providing direction and control to that worker? And am I telling them when to come in, when to clock out? Am I giving them training of how to paint the wall, going back to that example? Or are they subject matter experts enough to know their own job, go in, do it, handle it, and with their own direction and independent counsel versus, being trained and developed by the company that is actually tapping into this talent pool? So those are all of the different elements when we're thinking about W-2 and 1099. And to put the cherry on top, we're in a new presidential administration, right? So there have been some rumblings. In fact, they're not rumblings. There have been very clear plans of what could potentially happen when it comes to independent contractor classifications from a federal level that some folks are indicating could very much mirror what Trump tried to do 4 years ago when he was in office. These are going to be more employer-centric, as we know, could be more favorable for the employers or organizations that are looking to tap into these talent pools, as opposed to the Biden administration that was really favoring some of the California policies that were in place when it came to, whether or not that independent contractor can actually classify it. It was a little bit more tightened, I guess you could say. So I know that was a super loaded answer, but hopefully that gives a good oversight in terms of W-2 versus 1099 and the kind of the historical context of
Right.
what we're sitting in, because it could change like next week. Who knows?
Yeah, so I think the to sum it up is like it depends, and there's a lot of other factors to look at. What state are you in? You know,
Mhm.
the type of work you're doing. Is it open-ended? Is it finite? Et cetera. But it definitely is a consideration, and one just given the option for W-2 sounds like maybe you shouldn't just take it because it's there. But again, kind of look at the different considerations and implications of one versus the other. So a lot of folks that, most of the work that we do is in the fractional space, which to me is a fraction of a work week versus, 40 hours a week, which is the typical staff aug type of model. So are there any limitations on the W-2 side if looking to do fractional work? Like, isn't it like 20 hours a week plus you could qualify for W-2? Anything below that, you would just automatically be mandated to go the 1099 route? Can you talk a little bit about that?
You would think that there's some kind of clarity in that space, but not really. So there's part-time and full-time designations, right? So you remember getting your first job in high school, you were definitely a W-2 employee, but you only did maybe 12 hours a week, whatever it is.
Sure.
So not necessarily banded by the number of working hours that are fulfilled. However, right, going back to IRS and DOL guidelines, fractional support is somewhat more friendly, quote unquote, in my opinion, on the independent contractor classification front, because it is somebody, again, going back to having direction and control. They're going in to do the job and it's finite and they can do it in a perceived amount of time, even if that means it's 40 hours or 4 hours. More than likely, if it is fractional, then that subject matter expertise that they're providing is able to be done so in a matter of a couple of hours every single week. However, you can still qualify as W-2 on the same front on a part-time assumption.
Understood. Yeah, that's super interesting because there's definitely a camp of folks that believe fractional would be, your embedded resource indefinitely. I'm more kind of in the camp that a fractional resource should come in, they do their job, and if they're doing it successfully, 3, 6 months later, they roll off and go to another project.
Right.
So that's super interesting. And then in that vein, the question of insurance comes up a tremendous amount. I feel like we're obviously a pretty litigious society. My insurance policy has gone up the last 2 years just based upon cyber alone, which is just insane. As it pertains to the independent consultant, contractor, whatever you want to call them, do they really need insurance to engage on like most types of projects? Does it matter if they're handling finances or not, they're strategic or tactical? Any insight there?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, going back to what my personal opinion is, if you have your own business, you need insurance, period, right? It doesn't matter what kind of business that is, especially if it is a fractional capacity with professional working natures, because you're probably offering some form of strategic intel, oversight, potentially process impact to the various clients that you're servicing. It's not only going to be a requirement, as we mentioned earlier, in some of the contracts that you're choosing to work in and out of,
Sure.
but it's also going to protect your business if a claim or something like that were to come up. In my opinion, it's a no-brainer. You've got to get it, whether or not you're having your own business in a completely different industry with multiple workers, or you're just doing this independently. It's smart, and at a minimum, you want to consider basic coverages like general liability, a form of professional liability, a form of errors and omissions that would, definitely cover you in the event of some kind of marginal error that was done in some of the work that was procured. And then, in some cases, cyber liability if what you're doing is in the respect of errors and omissions when it comes to technical liability policies. So I think it behooves you to really consider what is going to be the right insurance packages. And the benefit of this, right, is that there's brokers out there that exist that specialize in independent contractor type of insurance policies. And some that I've seen in the market, Beau, actually cover you specifically for the role. So you might have to go in through one broker that says you've got to go ahead and get the coverage on an annualized assumptions. But there's other brokers that can actually provide coverage specific to this role for 3 months. And that's really what you're committed to. So definitely go out and see and know what options you have available.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's table stakes nowadays. And much to your point, most of the agreements we get into, there is an expectation that there is insurance carried. And if there is not insurance carried, there's no business to be had, period. So I agree
Yeah.
with you. And then what about the independent consultant that maybe is working with an agency? Can the agency's insurance cover them, or are you still a proponent that, hey, on the individual level, and I know it's also a state by state basis, so it can get very, very muddy. But what are your thoughts there?
Uh, my own opinion, the older I get insurance, the more insurance you should have, right? Like
I
it
mess
just
around, right?
don't mess around. There are going to be, and that's essentially what we do when we come in as a vendor of record. There's a policy that can aggregate to certain types of claims, but at the end of the day, you really want to consider something ongoing to protect yourself and your own business. You never know how claims can roll out, who's going to be the protected party, who is not, if they can actually come in and file a claim against your party. So it's never that black and white. And for those more grayer situations, which is most of the time, you really want to make sure that you're adding some level of protection.
Which ties back to kind of the first question in regards to getting set up in an LLC, just to kind of protect your personal assets, separate them from the businesses, which I think is critical. Two more questions, we'll get you out of here. Thanks so much for your time, Angela. Any tax implications that you can share for independent consultants, maybe operating as an independent consultant via in an LLC or W-2 or solopreneur?
Yeah, I mean, really, the biggest thing is that you're operating as your own independent business entity, right? So there are going to be, tax implications that are required for any type of business that need to be filed on a state and federal basis, maybe even a local basis, depending on the type of services that you're producing and where you're producing. There's certain counties that would require taxes. There's certain states that would require taxes, sales taxes for the type of services that you provide in the state that you're providing. So definitely know what those tax implications are based off of the type of services, but also know what areas you have in terms of business expenses, how you can file those business expenses, and actually further protect yourself in actually being able to adequately and accurately file your own business incurred expenses is just as critical. It's a holistic look at your taxes that you're obligated to pay, but also what expenses that you can obviously report off of too are very critical elements in this process.
Yeah, I think that also underscores the importance of having the right counsel, from legal to accounting, et cetera. One of the smartest things that I did, although I think it was 3 or 4 years into my business, was, part of the payroll company, and that took a lot of the liability and the heavy lifting kind of off of my plate, and made everything a lot clearer. And I think that's a good segue into, kind of last question for you in regards to MyBasePay. So, if an independent contractor was out there, they need maybe support on the payroll side, like what are some of the benefits they could accrue by partnering with a company like yours?
Yeah, so there's a good amount of our workers right now that are independent contractors, and the benefits for them through our model is that they have a predictable payment cycle that they can base their business and budgets off of. It's hard to do that when you are actually anticipating your payments to come in based off of the AR cycle of certain companies.
Never on time.
Yeah, never on time. I think the average DSO in our industry right now is 54, 56 days, anywhere between there. So, think about, how that cash flow can really help in terms of having that stability that is predictable and incoming through your business. That's one of the biggest advantages that we have. So the workers that are in our platform, invoice for those hours, get paid the following week for those hours, assuming that they've been approved, right? And then we handle really the areas after that when it comes to invoicing the end client, collecting on the end client. So that is far and away one of the bigger advantages. The other advantages that you can think through are some of the areas that we've noted in today's show when it comes to some aggregate insurance coverage options through a liable party that's contractually engaged with the end client, and also ensuring all of the requirements within this end client's MSA are being fulfilled. So that, and I think that there's one incalculable element of all of this, and that's the cost of compliance, right? And ensuring that you're actually going through a trusted party that is looking at prioritizing compliance with utmost importance. so
Mhm.
that you can rest assured, and also the end client can rest assured that things are being handled outside of how they're supposed to be handled on the MSA, but from a statutory and regulatory lens as well.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense to kind of underscore. So again, this could happen, the services that you just mentioned could be at the agency level or the independent consultant level, correct? So an independent consultant could partner with MyBasePay and you take care of the payroll float, some of the compliance component in the back end, et cetera.
Yes, absolutely. And those are benefits that are extended. But what we really walk through is at the experience of the independent consultant level, and some of the advantages that they're getting as well. Similarly, the staffing agency, the recruiting firm, the direct hire, the independent recruiter can also utilize us for those same advantages.
Excellent. So Angela, thanks so much for your time. Where can people find you? I know you've got a podcast that you're about to launch. You got a lot going on in your world.
Yes.
Where's
Yes.
the place
And
to?
better believe we're going to have Beau on that podcast, but you guys can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with you guys. My email is very easy too. It's Angela@MyBasePay.com. Happy to connect and dive deeper into the world of work with any of you.
Excellent. We'll be sure to add a link to the notes as well as the video here. And Angela, thanks so much for joining. Truly appreciate it. This topic is top of mind to a lot of independent consultants out there as they're considering making the link. So thanks so much for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Awesome.